Hello everyone, and welcome back to another Cutter 8 Commander Precon Upgrade Guide, the series where we bring Precon decks up to Cutter 8 standards without breaking the bank. As usual, this is your host Grazzet, and today we'll be tackling the final Final Fantasy Precon from this set, that being the Final Fantasy VI Revival Trance Precon, helmed by the former slave turned rebel turned savior, Terra, Herald of Hope, to which we'll be adding $30 worth of upgrades to give it a budget but considerable power-up. But before we continue, please do consider liking, commenting, and subscribing if you enjoy this content, and if you really like it, also consider supporting the channel directly either through my Buy Me a Coffee to help keep me caffeinated, or through my Game Nerds affiliate link to net me those sweet kickbacks through any purchases made through them to help fuel my caffeine addiction that way, both in the description below. Now, with all that chilling out of the way, let's kick off this upgrade guide by taking a deeper look at its commander and the base deck itself. Terra Herald of Hope is a 3/3 human wizard warrior that costs Mardu and that has the following two abilities. Firstly, at the beginning of combat on our turn, we mill 2 cards and Terra gains flying until end of turn. And secondly, whenever Terra deals combat damage to a player, we may pay 2 to return target creature of power 3 or less from our graveyard to the battlefield tapped. Taking a closer look at our commander's strengths, it becomes immediately clear that Terra is a potent self-enabling reanimation piece, able to both repeatedly get cards into our bin and reanimate them all on her own without having to rely too much on other cards to enable her. This of course is dependent on her ability to get in for damage reliably, but seeing as she can make herself evasive on our turn, we should rarely have an issue cracking into at least one of our opponents safely in any given game to proc her reanimation. And then with her low CMC allowing her to hit the board early to get that graveyard setup and reanimation game plan off the ground quickly, we can see that there's a lot to like about her kit. However, like most things, we have to take the good with the bad, and in Terra's case, the fact that she's limited to 3 or less power creatures is the greatest hurdle we'll need to overcome, seeing as this restriction immediately makes a lot of staple reanimation targets incompatible with her due to being simply too big, and those that we do have access to often being smaller stat-wise than what our opponents can bring to bear against us. This then coupled with her mandatory self-mill occasionally hitting our non-creature spells, which she cannot get back for us on her own, we'll need to make sure to carefully curate the contents of our 99 with both creatures whose effects outweigh their low power, and with ways to make use of any non-creatures we mill over in order to get the maximum usage out of any build she's headlining. And when we go over the contents of the base deck, we'll see that both of these elements have been taken into consideration at least to a degree, as it contains 23 power 3 or less creatures out of the gate, many of which have graveyard synergizing abilities to better enable our game plan, along with 17 sources of reanimation that, while primarily targeting our creatures, does contain a handful of ways to reanimate non-creatures as well, making the deck decently synergistic with our commander's graveyard-focused game plan out of the box. That's not to say that there isn't room for improvement, however, as the base deck's creature base does still contain a decent number of high-power creatures that our commander can't take full advantage of, and while the deck does have a solid 19 sources of graveyard set up to fill our bin from outside of the battlefield, it only contains 2 sack effects to get those creatures back into the bin from play, as well as only 4 cards that care about the graveyard outside of reanimation, ultimately leaving a lot of value on the table that we can build upon to make this already decent deck even better. So, seeing as our commander is very much dependent on power 3 or less creatures to get the maximum usage out of her reanimation, it shouldn't come as any surprise that most of our upgrades will come in the form of overhauling this build's creature base, with us refining our reanimation package and reanimation targets with lots of new impactful low power entries that we can more easily reuse, adding in even more graveyard setup and self-sacking effects to help us build up our bin from both on and off of the battlefield, and even slotting in a couple of new graveyard matters payoffs to generate even more value from our bin outside of reanimation, which alongside the handful of non-creature graveyard filling support pieces that we'll be adding alongside them, should result in a build much better equipped to use our bin as a reusable resource with Terra at the helm. So let's dive into the world of Final Fantasy VI, and the war-torn world that Terra calls home. Born to an Esper father and a human mother, Terra's suffering began when she was just a baby, her mother being slain and the Gestalian Empire taking her to be raised as a living weapon. In fact, she was so powerful of a weapon that Kefka himself took interest in her, placing a slave crown on her to force her compliance and then using her overwhelming magical power to crush any of those who opposed the Empire's will. But once she was freed from his control by the Returners, a group of rebels trying to prevent the Empire from conquering the world, she vowed to use her powers against her former captors and free the world from their tyranny, if only to prevent another child from suffering the same fate as she had, and whose strength was instrumental in defeating the mad god Kefka to save their world. So, now that we have a better understanding of the commander and the base deck, let's see what we can do to improve it. Kicking things off with us making some refinements to the base build's reanimation package, which is by no means bad as it contains very decent reusable and one-shot sources of it already. We'll be aiming to make it even better by including an entire suite of it on low power bodies for us to reuse and abuse alongside Terra. For example, we'll be decommissioning the Falcon Airship Restored, which may be cheap to bring down initially and sends itself to the bin when reanimating, but seeing as we'll usually have to pay 5 a pop to bring it back after we use it, we'll instead replace it with Karmic Guide, which still sacks itself, our commander can actually bring back, and reanimates on ETB so that we can use its effect multiple times per turn alongside sack outlets, and reburying Sepulchral Primordial, which may be good in a traditional reanimation deck as a mass reanimation piece, but is just too big for this one, to make room for Sister Hospitaller, which may be limited to only reanimating a single target on ETB, but does gain us life when it does so to help pad our life totals against our opponent's damage and our own self-damaging effects. Then from there, we'll be adding some legendary reanimation pieces by cutting Interceptor Shadow's Hound, who would be a better fit as a payoff in an Assassin Tribal build rather than a self-reanimating vanilla body in this one, so we can add in Alesha who laughs at fate, who instead takes advantage of our relatively low mana curve by providing repeatable reanimation to our CMC2 or lower creatures, and quickly ramps up to reanimating higher CMC creatures as she cracks in and grows, which her built-in first strike makes considerably easier, and scrapping Coin of Fate, which I'm not the biggest fan of since it gives our opponents the choice of which creature we can reanimate, while again being hard to recycle in this build, in favor of Joshua Phoenix's Dominant, who comes down as graveyard setup initially that lets us pitch reanimation targets from our hand into the bin, but will be quickly transforming into Phoenix Warden of Fire, whose combination of lifelink and AoE burn on his first 2 chapters are very good at keeping our life totals nice and topped off, and whose last chapter can easily reanimate multiple creatures for us to build up our board with, only to have him flip back over and start the process all over again. And finally, as our last new reanimation piece, we'll be sidelining Sun Titan, whose permanent reanimation would be great here so we can actually hit artifacts, enchantments, and even lands for ramp if we need to, but whose high stats again make him not as good here as it would be in other builds, so we'll be replacing it with Redemption Choir, which functionally has the same effect with the caveat that we need to control 3 different power creatures to proc it, which isn't really an issue for this build since we have plenty of creatures between 1 and 3 power, giving us all the same benefits as Sun Titan on an infinitely easier to reanimate body. So, now that we've made some significant improvements on how we're going to get our creatures back into play from our bin, let's move on to the changes we'll be making to how we get those creatures there in the first place. Seeing as the base deck already has a decent number of ways to get cards from our hand or deck into the graveyard, the majority of the changes we'll be making here will be focused on our ability to sacrifice creatures in play so we can more easily reuse their effects after they've been reanimated, though we will still be making some minor improvements to the former categories to beef them up ever so slightly. So, knocking those changes out of the way first, we'll be recycling the massive land cyclers, Ruin Grinder and Angel of the Ruins, which are again just too big for this build to easily reanimate even though they can easily send themselves to the bin, to make space for Faithless Looting and Thrill of Possibility, both of which give us access to cheap self-discard so that we can pitch any reanimation targets to our bin as we dig deeper into our deck for more resources, the former even allowing us to do so from the bin if we mill it over, and again, again, smelting down the far too large self-milling combustible gear hulk in favor of the significantly cheaper self-milling enchantment Ripples of Undeath, which admittedly is still hard for us to reanimate if we mill it over, although not impossible, but whose passive ability to mill us 3 on our turn, while giving us the option to cheaply keep one of those cards as pseudo-draw, makes it well worth running despite that as another source of consistent graveyard setup and card advantage in my opinion. Then proceeding to our new sacrifice-focused editions, we'll begin by replacing the legend Edgar Master Machinist, whose artifact reanimation can be useful, but this build lacks the critical mass of them needed to get the most out of it, with the more on-theme legend Braid's Arisen Nightmare, whose repeatable sack every rotation not only passively keeps sending our reanimation targets to the bin for us to reanimate, but also forces our opponents to either sacrifice their permanents or let us draw every time we do so for added disruption and value, as well as swapping out Setzer Wandering Gambler, whose vehicle and coin flip dependent ramp doesn't synergize with our game plan at all, so we can swap in Priest of Forgotten Gods, which again provides more repeatable on-demand self-sacrifice so we can quote-unquote reset our reanimation targets already in play, this time at instant speed and simultaneously generating us value in the form of ramp and draw while harming our opponents with a Forced Edict and life loss. And then to close out our new sack effects with a suite of creatures who can sacrifice themselves, we'll be raising one of the build's excess basic planes so we can slot in Selfless Spirit, whose ability to sack itself to grant the rest of our creature base indestructibility is superb at keeping our board state intact against mass removal and wipes, allowing us to use our reanimation to continue building up our board rather than having to use it to rebuild it from scratch, and shelving the subpar removal spells Crackling Doom and Legions to Ashes, along with the partial wipe Tragic Arrogance, so we can add the AoE Edict suite of Accursed Marauder, Demon's Disciple, and Plague Crafter, all of which force all our opponents to sack creatures every time they come down, only for us to sacrifice them to their own effect so that we can continue making use of their disruption over and over again. Now, having covered all the new pieces we'll be using to fill up our graveyard, let's wrap up our upgrades by going over the new low power reanimation targets that we'll be sending to the bin with them. Even when we consider all the changes we've already made to our creature base, and a solid selection of removal and value low power reanimation targets that we left in, there are still a handful of either too big or too low impact entrants from the base build that we'll be using the remainder of our budget to replace, specifically with creatures that work better alongside our commander thanks to the disruption, value, and even commander support they bring to the table. So, starting off with our new removal additions, we'll be freeing Palace Jailer, whose ETB O-Ring style effect and Monarch granting are serviceable if temporary removal and draw, but pale in comparison to its replacement, Lauren of the Third Path, who brings much more permanent back row removal to the table, and, should we need it, can still provide repeatable card advantage if we're also willing to provide it to another player at the table, and releasing Umaro Raging Yeti back into the wild, who's too big and too random for us to make good use of here, so we can give its enclosure to Ravenous Chupacabra, who functions as a simple no-nonsense creature removal spell on a body for us to use over and over again to deal with our opponent's threats. Then, on the more value-oriented side of things, we'll be scrapping the Venerable Mana Rock Commander Sphere for the newer and more modern ramp and draw source Professional Facebreaker, which works perfectly alongside Terra's evasive body to repeatedly generate treasures for us that we can use to either cast more spells or that we can instead crack for impulse draw as needed. From there, we'll be adding just a bit more non-permanent recursion to the build by cutting Flayer of the Hatebound, which yes, can pile on the damage as we continually get creatures out of our graveyard, but it's just too hard to reanimate or hardcast in this build, so we'll be running Pinnacle Monk in its place, which, alongside Esper Valigarmanda, gives us another way to recur the powerful instants and sorceries included in the base build if we mill them over or just want to use them again. And then as the final pair of creature changes we'll be making, this time to better enable our commander, we'll be replacing the legends Stragowen Realm and Kefka Dancing Mad, both of which would find much better success in either a Theft or Cast from Exile themed build rather than this one, with Fear of Missing Out and Aurelia the War Leader, both of which are much better here by allowing Terra to mill and reanimate more often via their extra combat phases, the former coming online quickly as we fill up our bin while providing reanimating graveyard setup itself, though it only untaps a single creature, usually Terra, for the extra attack, while the latter instead untaps our entire board to both net us additional value out of our commander, while enabling powerful alpha strikes from the rest of our board to close out the game. So, now that we've covered all the upgrades we've made to the deck, let's take a look at this build's final breakdown. Looking at the stats that matter to our game plan, we have 35 creatures of power 3 or less, giving Terra plenty of targets to reanimate for us, 16 sources of reanimation, and 6 cards that care about our graveyard outside of reanimation so that we may generate plenty of value from our bin alongside our commander, as well as 19 sources of graveyard setup in the form of self-discard and mill, and 7 sack effects, giving us plenty of ways to get our creatures into the bin from both on and off of the battlefield for our commander and other reanimation sources to put right back into play. For general deck stats, our final build has 15 ramp sources, 12 card draw sources, 11 targeted removal sources, and 2 board wipes, though it should be noted that while our removal package may appear average, the vast majority of it is repeatable by virtue of being tacked on to low power bodies, making this build's ability to disrupt our opponents much better than it may initially appear. Then looking at our mana curve, we have an average CMC of 3.30, which is again somewhat deceptive since we'll rarely be casting anything over CMC 4, instead opting to get our commander on board quickly so she can begin filling up our bin and cheating our creatures into play instead. The total price of all the upgrades we made here then totals out to be $30.30, which doesn't include tax or shipping or the base price of the deck itself, which, unlike all the other precons from this set, is actually a reasonable $55 for the cheapest one I could find, making it the easiest to acquire if you're an old school fan of the franchise. Now, if we're looking to upgrade this deck even further by increasing the budget, for an additional $5 budget increase, we can consider cutting Sabine Master Monk, whose repeatable graveyard setup and cantrip via his self-reanimating Blitz can be useful, but is usually too mana intensive for us, and a one-time removal spell Mortify, which may be flexible but isn't all that easy for us to recur, in favor of either the commander-enabling Blade Historian and the spot removal MDFC Witch Enchanter, the former's AoE double strike granting on attack, netting us both double the reanimation triggers off of Terra and double the damage output from our entire board as we swing in, while the latter lets us play it as a land if we're desperate, but more often, we'll be using it as another repeatable source of backer removal to help us pick apart our opponent's boards even more, or alternatively, replacing them instead with the more on-theme Douthie Voidwalker and Buried Alive, the first's passive enemy-only exile effect being an excellent silver bullet against any other graveyard-focused decks we may encounter, and their ability to sack themselves to let us cast one of those exiled cards at no mana cost is an excellent source of repeatable value, while the second provides exceptional graveyard tutoring so that we can get exactly the reanimation targets we need into our bin when we need them. Then, for a total $15 budget increase, we can also look into replacing Esper to Magicite, which is a fine piece of graveyard hate and enemy theft source, but not as good in this build for us as either Tival's Judgment, which provides us with repeatable ramp in the form of treasure and card advantage as we reanimate our creatures turn after turn for added value, or Ashnod's Altar, which instead gives us access to another instant speed sack outlet that produces the exact amount of mana we need to proc Terra's reanimation, making it an excellent way to recycle our creatures already in play. And then for a total $30 budget increase, we can think about replacing Demon's Disciple's AoE Edict effect with either the cheap Graveyard Tutor Entomb for yet another dirt cheap way to enable our commander's reanimation for added consistency, or Grim Hireling if we'd rather add some repeatable treasure generation and non-destruction removal to the build for more value and disruption. And finally, for those of us with money to burn or too little sense to budget appropriately, we can bring the shiniest toys to bear against our opponents, where we can replace Archfiend of Depravity's admittedly powerful but too hard to reanimate AoE Masked Edict with either Warren's Soul Trader, who gives us access to an instant speed treasure generating sack outlet for us to use for value and graveyard setup, the Summon Knights of the Round, which generates a huge amount of board presence and then makes our key reanimation pieces indestructible to make it even harder for our opponents to deal with them, or the one-winged angel himself, Sephiroth Fabled Soldier, whose price may make your wallet cry, but who functions perfectly in this deck as initially a sack outlet that generates us repeatable card advantage that, alongside our self-sack effects and edicts, can quickly transform into Sephiroth One-Winged Angel, granting us an even bigger evasive body to crack in with, and an emblem that turns every creature we or our opponents lose into life gain for us and life loss for them to help close out games considerably faster. Thanks everyone for sticking around until the end of the video. So, with the Revival Trance Precon completed, it's time for us to once again open the polls for you folks to vote on which commander from this set you'd like to see me build around, with this week's contenders being the alternate commanders from the precons we just covered, those being the extra combat granting Tifa Martial Artist, the +1/+1 counter granting and moving Yuna Grand Summoner, the hero token creating Garatia Scion Reborn, and a graveyard filling and board empowering Celeste Rune Knight. So be sure to cast your vote in the community tab, link in the description, before the deadline on June 20th. And while we wait on those results, I'll either be taking a short 1-week break to recover from releasing all of these precons back to back, or alternatively releasing a build featuring a mystery commander of my choice if I can't stay away from deck building. Though you should all know my decision by next week by whether or not I upload a video or not. But before you go, as usual, please do like, comment, and subscribe to help keep the almighty algorithm appeased. Consider donating to my Buy Me a Coffee or buying product through my Game Nerds affiliate link if you want to throw a few bucks my way so I can keep making this content. And be sure to check out all my other deck techs either floating around my head or on the playlist above if you want to see more content like this one. And with that, have a good one folks, and stay safe.